Today we're ranking some of the biggest flops in the history of Apple MacBooks, going from the ones that were just hated at release to those that could genuinely break without warning straight after purchase. And yes, I did actually buy the worst one on this list, just to see how appalling it really was. For now though, let's start with the base model 2019 13-inch MacBook Pro, probably the worst value MacBook ever produced. So in May 2019, Apple released their newest 13-inch MacBook Pros. They came with quad-core i5 or i7 processors, 8 or 16 GB of RAM, and started with 256 gigs of storage, all for the bargain price of $1,800. Insane, really. But to add insult to injury, and I still have no idea why Apple pulled this move, 2 more 13-inch Pros were released just 2 months later, with this one probably the worst of the entire bunch. It's got a 1.4 to 3.9 GHz 8th Gen i5 processor. Yes, 8th generation Intel chips were already 2 years old when this thing dropped. As it's the base model, there are 8 GB of RAM on board. Not terrible for 2019, but what is terrible is the fact that it's DDR3 memory. I built my first PC in 2019, a super budget build, and I still managed to scrape the funds together for 16 GB of DDR4 because even I knew DDR3 was already on its way out. Apparently Apple hadn't that kind of foresight. That or they didn't care. Not much better on storage, this MacBook has just 128 GB of SSD drive capacity. Insane for a product aimed pretty strongly at professionals working in media production. Imagine video editing on one of these. To top it all off, this MacBook has just 2 USB-C ports and a headphone jack. That's it. The cost of the base 2019 13-inch MacBook Pro is probably the worst thing though. It started at £1,300 or US dollars. $1,300 for an outdated CPU, outdated DDR3 memory, 128 gigs of storage, and 2 ports. It's easy to laugh now this is in the past, but people got absolutely screwed over buying these in 2019. And to make things worse, the M1 MacBook Air released just over a year later and completely changed the laptop game because of how good it was despite costing under $1,000 US dollars. This thing does get bonus points for looking great in silver and having the touch bar, which was pretty cool. Overall, a horrible MacBook though. Horrendous for the price. Next up, the 2015 12-inch MacBook. I know lots of you watching will be fond of this machine for its unique design. There's never been a smaller or lighter MacBook since, which is undeniably impressive. Really though, that's where the positives end. This MacBook had 1 port, which was USB-C, and this was in 2015, far before USB-C had become standard for most people, so if you wanted to plug anything else in while charging, you just had to get a dock of some sort. This MacBook didn't seem to make sense from a business standpoint either. It was a super light laptop, almost like an entry-level mini MacBook. But presumably because of the R&D required to produce something like this, it cost a lot. Despite having an almost 30% weaker processor, the 12-inch MacBook cost $400 more than the MacBook Air of the same year. This thing started at $1,299 US dollars or UK pounds. That's more MacBook Pro money than anything, but there's nothing pro about this computer. It has a dual-core ultra-low power Intel M chip that only boosts up to 2.4 GHz. It's barely capable of running more than a few web pages, and it's passively cooled, meaning no fans whatsoever. Too much stress and this thing would understandably overheat or just give up altogether and thermally throttle. Also, professionals who needed to type a lot on their MacBooks were among the first to notice a glaring issue with this one. In order to fit everything into their new, slimmer laptops, Apple had redesigned their keyboard technology entirely. The 2015 12-inch MacBook was the first to have the so-called butterfly keyboard, which became infamous for sporting incredibly unreliable switches which would often jam and leave keys completely unusable. So many people began reporting issues with these keyboards that Apple ended up having to pay a $50 million settlement to those impacted over the years after this laptop's release. As I said, it's hard to discount the strides this laptop made in bringing a completely new form factor to the table, but it never really made sense financially, and it was an extremely weak performer from the very beginning. Okay, now we're moving on to the laptops with serious issues. Buy these at your own risk. This isn't going to be a popular take. I can smell the hate comments coming from a mile away here, but I believe the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro might be the second worst MacBook of all time. First of all, you've got the glaringly obvious. It was practically the final MacBook Apple would release with an Intel chip. In 2020 and beyond, Apple released game-changing Apple Silicon-powered Macs that frankly blew this thing out of the water. Sure, the graphics on the 2019 were still pretty great, but only until M1 Max came along in 2021. So buying this 16-inch 2019 machine was a big mistake for most people, as it was very quickly outclassed by its younger brothers, the M1 powered devices. Beyond that though, this laptop had some design flaws Apple are honestly lucky to not have faced a lawsuit over. On their logic boards, the NAND voltage regulator circuit is flawed straight out of the factory. It's pretty common for that part to fail and zap the storage chips beyond repair without warning. Creators Louis Rossmann and DOSDude1 have both covered this in depth, so if you want a more technical breakdown, definitely check out their videos on this computer and its issues. We can't forget about the overheating either. The 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pros were the first of a new design, made thicker to allow for better cooling so that the components wouldn't overheat and slow themselves down. The problem was though, Apple went on to cram even faster and more power-hungry parts into that body. The result was a MacBook with fans kicking in if you opened more than a single browser tab at once. I owned one of these in my first year of university, also the year I started this channel, and it was just as bad, if not worse than everyone says. Trying to record quiet voiceovers with the fans running even a little bit was a real pain. Lately these Macs have been going for crazy prices on eBay, but it's not hard to imagine why. macOS Tahoe has been confirmed as the last update this thing will officially receive, giving it a support window of just 6 years by the way. So while the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro was a game changer for laptop speakers, screen quality and graphics, it's impossible to ignore just how insanely poor of an investment this thing ended up being. I could keep on bringing up new issues by the way. Did you know its price started at $2,400? That was for the base model. A laptop beaten easily by the $999 MacBook Air released the very next year. Okay, if you're big into MacBooks, you've probably seen this one coming a mile away. The 15 and 17-inch 2011 MacBook Pros are unfortunately on their own special level of failure. At release, these things were a pretty giant step forward in graphics and processing power, with quad-core CPUs included for the first time in a MacBook Pro. This unibody design was among the best too, with practically all major parts removable with a screwdriver. The two biggest 2011 models had one fatal problem though. Their graphics chips would fail without warning, basically reducing them to paperweights like this one. In 2021, I bought one of these, had it working fine, and then sold it on to someone else. The next day, it came back looking like this. Lines on the screen, sometimes not even booting. Safe to say I had to refund the buyer and flat out lost the money. It felt bad then, but imagine buying one of these for $2,000 odd brand new and having it die when you were using it for something actually important. Apple did offer to replace the ones that broke, but they were still flawed laptops. Knowing the risk of owning one of these, you'd have to fight to get your money back, and then buy an older MacBook, or I guess wait for something new to come out, if you even wanted a MacBook after all of that. The GPU failure was brought about by poor quality control when it came to assembling the motherboards, something it's fair to say was quite preventable. It's hard to measure the impact of such an issue years after the fact, but the 2011 MacBook Pro no doubt damaged Apple's reputation hugely when it came to laptops. Luckily for them, by 2011 their business was well diversified, with income from iPhone, iPod and iPad sales contributing to a huge amount of their income. So Apple stock didn't take a noticeable hit. Having people, like me, still talking about the issues this computer had 15 years later proves how significant of a flop this laptop really was. I've no idea what I'm going to do with this one, I guess I'll sell it for parts eventually. So these, in my book, are the 4 worst MacBooks Apple has produced to this day. We're in a weird situation right now where no truly bad MacBooks have come out for a while. There haven't been many outright failures across the entire Mac lineup actually since the 2020 introduction of Apple Silicon, perhaps with the exception of the M2 Mac Pro for its non-upgradability and the base M3 MacBook Pro because it marked the removal of the 13-inch form factor altogether. So thank you very much for watching. Special thanks to my Patreon members, of course, whose support is enormously helpful for smaller channels like mine. Subscribe for more, join the Discord server if the topic interests you, and I'll see you next week.